Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Evelyn Wade had lived her life in shadows, not the kind that lurk under trees or bed sheets, but the kind that wrap around a person slowly, like ivy climbing a wall, until you forget what sunlight ever felt like. Carriage Falls wasn't the kind of town that made headlines or held secrets worth stealing. It sat quietly between green hills and narrow roads, its train station half abandoned, its people half awake. Evelyn's days at the Bramley Inn were measured by the clink of teacups and the smell of overboiled potatoes. She moved through life like a whisper in a house full of closed doors, polite, dependable, invisible. No one asked too many questions, and maybe that's why she stayed. Owen Marner, however, was loud enough for the both of them. He had a voice like a church bell, impossible to ignore, often misplaced, sometimes cracked. He wore ambition like a jacket 2 sizes too big, always flapping behind him in the wind. His ideas were always bigger than his bank account, and he made promises with the ease of a man who never intended to keep them. Still, he had charm, the kind that aged poorly. He'd stroll into Bramley Inn with half a plan and a full grin, and the other waitresses would giggle while Evelyn kept her head down, pretending not to notice. But Owen noticed her. Not at first, but eventually, like someone noticing an old painting in the hallway they'd walked past 1,000 times. She wasn't beautiful in a loud way. She was quiet, constant, and that's what drew him, or perhaps what he thought would stay. Their story didn't begin with fireworks. It began with a handshake that lingered a little too long and a coffee shared on a bench outside the post office. Evelyn, at the time, had just buried her mother, a quiet woman whose hands were always cold and voice always soft, and she was still grieving in the way people do when there's no room for tears. Owen saw that grief and mistook it for need. He told her he'd take her places, not with maps or plans, but with words, always words. "We're too big for this place," he'd say, lighting another cigarette he couldn't afford. "You and me, we're gonna rise like steam." She believed him. Not because his words made sense, but because they came from someone who said them out loud. That alone felt like a beginning. Within a year, Evelyn was no longer just Evelyn. She was Owen's girl. He moved into her mother's old cottage and filled it with noise. Deals gone bad. Friends who talked too fast and laughed too loud. Evelyn kept washing dishes and folding napkins at Bramley Inn, her fingers always smelling faintly of lemon and soap. She didn't mind the quiet. But sometimes she'd catch herself staring out the window and wondering what it would feel like to walk into a room and be seen, not just looked at, but seen. Owen, meanwhile, never stopped performing. Every room he entered became a stage. Every failure a script he rewrote. He started calling himself a businessman. What business? No one could say. But he carried a briefcase full of blank papers and dreams too heavy to hold. Things weren't always bad. That would be a lie, and Evelyn didn't deal in lies, even the kind that sounded sweet in stories. There were mornings when he'd bring her coffee in bed, still warm, with a single sugar cube the way she liked. He'd kiss her forehead and call her sunshine, and for a brief moment she'd feel like the kind of woman who had a future with ribbons on it. They talked about leaving Carriage Falls often, usually at night, when the world felt soft and their worries shrank in the dark. Owen had a map above the kitchen table with pins and cities neither of them could pronounce. "Velvina," he said one night, tapping a name near the bottom of the map. "That's the one, Eve. Land of new money and old names. You and me, we'd fit right in." She laughed, but her heart fluttered. He spoke of Velvina like it was a secret paradise just waiting for them to show up and claim it. She imagined palm trees and champagne and quiet mornings where she didn't wake up worried. She didn't ask questions, even when he started making late-night calls and locking his phone. She trusted him. That was her first mistake, not because he didn't deserve it, but because she didn't know she deserved more. By the time the tickets were booked, Evelyn had already packed twice. She laid out his shirts with surgical care, ironed the collars, counted his ties. Her own clothes were folded tightly, plain blouses, soft skirts, one sensible pair of shoes. No one knew she was leaving, not really. She told her boss she needed a week for family, and he nodded without asking. Owen told anyone who'd listen that he had international meetings. He even bought a new suitcase, black leather, stitched initials, even though his shoes had holes and they still owed rent. Evelyn watched him strut through the cottage like a king in a borrowed castle. She smiled and helped him pack. She was used to holding his excitement, the way mothers hold children too wild to sit still. On the night before they left, he poured them both cheap wine and toasted to their last night in a town that never knew what it had. Evelyn didn't say anything. She just clinked her glass and sipped slowly. Her suitcase sat by the door, zipped tight, her whole life inside. That night, while he snored into a pillow stained with cologne, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her stomach a knot of nerves and hope. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't flying toward a dream. She was about to walk straight into a storm. The airport was larger than Evelyn had imagined. She had only seen them in movies, or on the dusty travel brochures that used to sit untouched in the corner of the local library back in Carriage Falls. In those films, airports always glittered, clean and fast-moving, places where people rushed toward opportunity or reunited under artificial lights. But Norfield International felt different. It hummed with tension. The ceiling stretched high above her like the inside of a cathedral, and the tiled floor echoed every footstep as if the ground itself was trying to remember who walked across it. Owen marched ahead with the kind of urgency people reserve for emergencies or egos. He dragged his suitcase as if it weighed less than the silence between them. Evelyn followed behind, slightly out of step, her small travel bag digging into her shoulder, the strap twisted, worn from years of holding too much for too long. Her passport felt heavy in her coat pocket, not because of weight, but because of what it symbolized. A ticket out, a door open, a promise made. They hadn't spoken much since they left the cottage, only exchanging shallow phrases like weather updates. Owen was glued to his phone, voice rising and falling like a tide that refused to recede. He threw numbers around, spoke of meetings with people Evelyn had never heard of, tossed in words like leverage and market exposure, the way a magician flings glitter to distract the audience from the sleight of hand. She walked beside him like a ghost tied to a living man. Their flight wasn't scheduled for another hour, but Owen insisted on arriving early. He liked to make a scene in the smallest ways, always arriving first, always acting as if the world should adjust its clock to his arrival. He found their gate 47B and flopped into a seat like he owned the row. Evelyn sat beside him, legs crossed neatly, her hands tucked beneath her bag for warmth. The cold air conditioning brushed her face, and the inside of the terminal buzzed with voices in a dozen accents. Children whined. Boarding announcements rang out, and travelers clutched coffees like life jackets. Owen tapped rapidly on his phone, chuckling now and then, likely at some message only he understood. Evelyn reached into her purse and retrieved a 20, murmuring that she'd get them something to drink. He waved a hand without looking up, a half-grunt of approval escaping him like smoke from a dying match. The coffee stand wasn't far, but the line curled like a snake around velvet ropes. She stood patiently, watching a toddler drop a biscuit and cry as if it were the end of the world. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. She ordered 2 juices, one orange with pulp, the other cranberry, because Owen hated coffee on travel days, said it made his stomach sound like a broken engine. She paid, picked up the drinks, and made her way back slowly, the cups trembling slightly as if they knew what was coming before she did. She didn't see the stumble happen. Not exactly. One second she was stepping around a stroller, the next her toe caught on the edge of a backpack someone had left slightly sticking into the walkway. It wasn't a dramatic fall, no gasp, no wild flailing. Just a soft jolt forward. Enough to throw her balance, enough to tip the cup in her right hand. Orange juice, thick, sweet, and freshly cold, splashed out in an arc. It landed with unceremonious fate right on Owen's suede shoes. The stain bloomed immediately, spreading across the tan like rust on steel. She froze, mouth half open, words trying to find their way through her lips. But Owen had already seen. His face shifted from boredom to disbelief to fury in the space of a single breath. He stood. The sound of his chair scraping back was louder than it should have been. Evelyn, eyes wide, stepped backward, trying to apologize. The cup fell from her hand, hit the floor, and rolled away like a coin flipped by fate. Owen's voice rose. Not loud at first. Sharp. He called her careless, useless. Said she was always doing things like this, small disasters, embarrassments, distractions from his path. People were watching now. Travelers, gate agents, even a child holding a balloon. Evelyn opened her mouth to say sorry again, but it was too late. His hand flew. Not with hesitation. Not in secret. Not hidden behind words. It cracked across her cheek like a door slammed in a storm. The sound hung in the air longer than it should have. Then silence. Heavy. Shameful. Everyone saw it, and no one said a thing. There was a moment after the slap, a fraction of time so thin it could barely be measured, when Evelyn thought she had died. Not in the dramatic sense, not with blood or sirens, but in that quiet, devastating way a person dies when something inside them finally breaks. Her ears rang. Her face stung. Her heartbeat thundered in her throat. But her body stayed still, stiff as an iron fence. Owen, still fuming, gathered his things. He didn't look at her. Not once. He barked something about getting on the damn flight and stormed toward the gate. The boarding announcement was calling for final passengers. Evelyn stood there, mouth closed, one hand gently touching the side of her face, not from pain, but disbelief. She hadn't even realized she was crying until a single tear reached the corner of her lips, salty and sharp. A woman 2 seats away stared at her, then quickly looked away. A man with headphones shifted uncomfortably. No one said a word. No one intervened. They all chose the easy thing, to pretend it hadn't happened. Evelyn was left holding a half-crushed boarding pass and a single cranberry juice cup with a shaky hand. She watched Owen walk away, his shoulders squared, his pace fast, as if running from a mirror he couldn't stand to look at. Then the door closed behind him. The flight took off without her. She didn't move. Something in her, the part that forgave too easily, had stayed on that plane. What remained at gate 47B was no longer someone waiting to follow. It was someone quietly preparing to become something else. Evelyn sat on the cold bench long after the final call faded from the overhead speakers. Her boarding pass was crumpled in her palm, soft as cloth now, her fingers stained slightly red from the cranberry juice cup she still hadn't let go of. She wasn't sure why she hadn't stood or screamed or chased after him. Maybe because she had spent too many years swallowing words before they ever reached her lips. The ache in her cheek had dulled into something deeper, heavier, not pain, but resignation. People moved around her like water around a stone, purposeful and blind, their footsteps echoing with the freedom of having somewhere to be. The world hadn't stopped spinning just because hers had. A young couple laughed nearby, the sound cutting through her stillness like a blade made of wind. A woman with a headset paced near the gate, calling names Evelyn didn't recognize, inviting strangers to futures she no longer felt welcome in. Her heart, slow and heavy, beat like a metronome that had lost its rhythm. She didn't know how long she sat there, maybe an hour, maybe more. Time had turned soft around her, like mist. She blinked once, then again, her gaze drifting to the large glass window overlooking the runway. A plane lifted into the sky. Not hers. His. Somewhere inside that silver body of steel and smoke, Owen was probably sipping complimentary wine, lying through his teeth to a stranger, already rewriting the story of what had happened. He would tell it his way, with himself as the victim, the hero, the misunderstood genius. And Evelyn, if mentioned at all, would be the burden he had to leave behind. Eventually she stood. Her knees wobbled, uncertain as a newborn foal, but she didn't fall. The cranberry juice, long warm and sticky, was left behind on the bench, a small red stain on the metal seat marking her absence. She walked slowly toward the exit, not quite sure where she was going, but certain she couldn't return to Carriage Falls. She couldn't stomach the thought of seeing her name whispered behind hands at Bramley Inn, her story told in pieces over chipped coffee cups by women who'd never dare say it to her face. No, she wasn't going back. Not like this. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Owen, short and jagged. You ruined everything. Don't contact me. She read it once, then again. Then she deleted it without responding. A part of her wanted to laugh, not the joyful kind, but the dry, hollow kind that breaks loose when your lungs forget how to cry. Outside the terminal, the air was sharp and heavy with fuel and late summer dust. She found a bench near the taxi bay and sat there again, arms folded, eyes glassy. Planes continued to land and take off. The sky didn't care. The earth didn't pause. She thought about hotels, remembered that the reservation Owen had made was in both their names. She still had her ID, the confirmation email. Her name was still on something. That was enough. That was a start. She stood up, hailed a taxi, and gave the driver the name of the hotel in Velveena, speaking softly, as if her voice hadn't yet forgiven her mouth for staying silent too long. The hotel was far grander than anything Evelyn had ever stepped foot in. Glass chandeliers dangled from the high ceiling like icicles made of moonlight. The floors were marble, polished to a mirror shine, and the scent of lavender and citrus hung in the air like a song hummed by wealth. The receptionist greeted her with professional warmth, not recognizing the storm behind Evelyn's eyes. She presented her ID, carefully avoiding the reflection of her bruised cheek in the counter's glass. Within minutes she was handed a room key, her own key, to a room meant for two. The elevator doors opened with a gentle chime, and she stepped in alone, her suitcase following behind her like a dog too loyal to leave. The room was on the 8th floor. Wide windows, soft bedding, 2 robes, 2 slippers, 1 Evelyn. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared out at the city skyline, her breath fogging the glass. The city looked alive, vibrant, completely unaware of the small, trembling woman staring down from above. She didn't unpack, didn't undress. She simply lay back on the bed, arms spread, eyes open. Hours passed. Day became night. Her stomach rumbled once, but she ignored it. She was too full of questions, regrets, anger. The pillow beneath her head smelled of nothing. Just cotton. No promises. No lies. Somewhere on the bedside table sat a notepad and a pen, placed for convenience, for leisure. But she didn't write anything. She had nothing to say. Not yet. The next morning came not like a fresh start, but like a verdict. Evelyn woke up with stiff limbs and the kind of exhaustion that no sleep could cure. Her body was rested, but her spirit dragged behind like a shadow bruised by too many days without light. She showered, not because she felt like it, but because her skin itched with the memory of being touched without kindness. The water was hot, too hot, and she let it burn. Her cheek had already begun to fade into yellow, the quiet kind of bruise, the one that doesn't shout anymore but still whispers. She wrapped herself in the white hotel robe and stood by the window again. Same view, same city. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. She dressed slowly. Buttoned her blouse with the kind of care usually reserved for preparing to meet someone important. And maybe she was. Maybe she was meeting herself for the first time, the version of Evelyn that hadn't yet been given space to breathe. Downstairs in the lobby, the world bustled with clinking cutlery, elevator dings, and polite laughter. She moved through it all like a ghost dressed in flesh. And then, near the back of the lobby, past the coffee bar and beside a tall potted plant, she heard an older man swearing under his breath while trying to balance a tray and a stack of papers. Something in her paused. Not sympathy, recognition. Chaos disguised as purpose. She approached quietly and asked if he needed help. He looked up, tired eyes, gray beard, shirt stained with coffee, and said, "If you know how to carry 3 cups without dropping them, you're already more qualified than half the people I've hired." She smiled, a small one, but real. That's how she met Nico Carroll, the man who would unknowingly help her build an empire from the ashes of a forgotten flight. Evelyn's first day behind the coffee stand inside the airport lobby didn't begin with confidence or certainty, but with the heavy, unfamiliar weight of wearing a borrowed apron and pretending she belonged in it. She stood behind the counter while Nico shuffled through invoices and supply forms, muttering under his breath as though the world had personally offended him by being disorganized. The machines hissed and gurgled, the smell of espresso strong enough to wake the dead, and the queue of travelers shifted constantly. Tired faces, rushed voices, and luggage dragging across tile like soft thunder. Evelyn didn't speak much. She listened, watched, learned. Her hands were slower than the others, but steadier. She had never made cappuccinos before, had never juggled pastries and paper sleeves and impatient businessmen, but she found her rhythm quicker than expected. There was something meditative in the repetition. Grind, pour, steam, serve. No one knew who she was. No one asked. That anonymity was its own kind of freedom. At night, when the stand closed and the lights above dimmed into a soft hum, Nico would sit at a back table with her, drinking decaf and talking about the aviation business like it was an old lover he never got over. He told her about planes he'd once owned, a small airstrip in Velvena's outskirts he used to run, and the time he flew through a lightning storm with nothing but instinct and stubbornness. His words were dipped in old regrets and long flights, and Evelyn found herself soaking in them. Not because she cared about airplanes, not yet, but because it was the first time someone spoke to her without expecting her to disappear. Weeks melted into months, and Evelyn's presence behind the stand went from unnoticed to expected. She became the girl who remembered your order even when you didn't, who slipped a sugar packet into your bag before you asked, who offered napkins with the kind of gentle smile that didn't feel like customer service. Some regulars began leaving small thank you notes folded inside tip jars. Others lingered a moment longer just to speak with her. She never gave too much of herself. Her past was a story she kept zipped shut like a suitcase that might burst if disturbed. Nico, on the other hand, had no shortage of stories. He spoke with the swagger of a man who had once been important and still wore the scent of that memory like cologne. He talked about aircraft deals gone sour, pilots who cheated fuel logs, clients who ran out of money mid-flight. In between those tales, he taught Evelyn things, not just about coffee, but about what it meant to run something. Inventory management, vendor negotiations, customer flow during peak hours. When one of the shift managers quit unexpectedly, Nico offered her the position without ceremony. "You're already doing the work. Might as well give you the title," he grumbled, tossing her the key. She didn't ask for a raise. He gave her one anyway. Underneath the cranky exterior, he noticed everything, including how she never called home. Including how she flinched whenever a loud voice echoed too close. On quieter days, he'd ask how she ended up there. Evelyn would shrug, say something vague, and change the subject. He never pushed, Some stories, he understood, had to be earned, not asked. By the second year, the coffee stand had become more than a job. It was a cocoon, a hiding place that slowly taught Evelyn how to be visible again without being vulnerable. The staff respected her. Customers trusted her. Nico leaned on her more than he'd admit. When a supplier began overcharging them, Evelyn found a loophole in the contract and renegotiated it. When an unruly traveler threw a fit over a delayed flight and took it out on a junior barista, she stepped in with a voice that was calm but firm enough to silence a storm. Word spread. Nico began bringing her into more serious discussions, talks about finances, airport lease agreements, hiring decisions. He started saying things like, "What do you think, Ev?" instead of barking orders. There was one afternoon, unusually hot and slow, when he took her to the airstrip he once mentioned in passing. It was overgrown, rusted in parts, weeds creeping through the cracks in the pavement, but Evelyn saw something else in it, a ghost of potential. Nico leaned against a broken fuel tank, sweat beading on his brow, and said, "I used to run charter flights out of here. Executives. Diplomats. Then business dried up. Couldn't keep up." Evelyn walked the perimeter in silence, the sun painting long shadows in front of her. She didn't say much, but her mind ticked, the way it did when she used to solve complicated bookings back at the inn. She saw not what it was, but what it could be. That night, she drew up ideas in her notebook. Nothing grand, nothing unrealistic. Just small steps, logical ones. The kind of thinking she had never been encouraged to believe in, until now. It wasn't long before the world Nico had built, slowly, clumsily, but with heart, began to shift under Evelyn's influence. She didn't take over. She didn't need to. She filled the cracks he hadn't realized were widening. When they rebranded the coffee stand with updated colors and sleeker uniforms, she was the one who chose the supplier. When they pitched a seasonal cafe inside the departure terminal for high-traffic weeks, she built the proposal and presented it, not with flair, but with precision. The airport board approved it unanimously. Nico watched with something between pride and disbelief. One morning, while stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, he muttered, "Never thought I'd see the day someone else knew more about my business than me." Evelyn smiled but said nothing. That same week, Nico fell ill. Nothing dramatic. Just exhaustion, he claimed. But it returned again and again. He stopped showing up daily. Evelyn covered without complaint. When his doctor insisted he cut down on stress, he looked at Evelyn and said, "You're already running the place. Might as well wear the badge." He handed her a set of keys, not to the coffee stand, but to the office upstairs, where real decisions were made. She didn't tremble. She didn't panic. She took them with steady fingers. The next morning, she walked into that office, opened the ledger, and began building something she hadn't known she was meant for. She didn't call it ambition. She called it doing the job. And with each decision, each page turned, she left further behind the girl who'd once stood silently by gate 47B, holding a bruised cheek and a cup of cranberry juice. That girl had not vanished. She had simply evolved. The rain came without warning that morning, a curtain of silver falling hard against the airport's glass walls as Evelyn sat behind her desk, reviewing an invoice that had been filed wrong 3 weeks ago. She had grown used to storms, not just the weather kind, but the ones people carried in their voices, the ones hiding in silence, and figures that didn't add up, and staff resignations delivered with too many apologies. She handled them the same way now, head down, eyes open, hands steady. The office Nico had given her had changed in small ways since she took the keys. The faded blinds had been replaced. The walls no longer held dust, but framed flight maps and charts she studied late into the evening. Her desk bore no family pictures, no flowers, only order. A white planner. A reliable pen. The only sentimental thing she allowed herself was a small brass model of a twin-engine plane Nico had left on the windowsill. It didn't have a name, but she polished it sometimes gently, as if memory itself needed to be dusted. That morning, as she listened to the rain tapping the window, she didn't yet know that a man from her past, one she had silently sworn never to speak of again, had just stepped through the terminal's main doors. She didn't know that the very man who had slapped the color out of her sky years ago had returned, not in triumph, but in ruin. Owen Marner had reappeared, wearing a rented suit and desperation stitched into every crease. He had come back not because he wanted to, but because he had nowhere else left to go. After his business ideas failed, one after another like a chain of cracked dominoes, and the money dried up like the last sip of stale wine, Owen found himself circling the drain of relevance. He'd spent years hopping from place to place, always hoping the next town, the next investor, the next lie would buy him just enough time to float a little longer. But every shortcut he took turned into a dead end. The charm that once drew people like moths now hung around him like a tattered flag from a war he lost quietly. When someone mentioned Eva in a conversation, a new airline run by a young executive with a sharp mind and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, he laughed at first. Then someone said the name out loud. Evelyn Wade. The laugh stopped. He remembered her. Not with regret, but with calculation. He told himself that she owed him something, that without him she'd still be pouring tea in a country inn. He convinced himself he could use her. That's what Owen did. He turned women into lifeboats, and then blamed them when they sank. With a false name printed on a fabricated business card, he booked a consultation meeting with the Vare's executive office, pitching himself as an independent logistics contractor. The receptionist didn't recognize him. Why would she? The man who once left Evelyn at a gate looked nothing like the man who now stood in Yver's lobby, shoulders sagging, hair thinning, the glow of ego long burned out. He waited with a nervous smile, rehearsing his lines like an actor long out of practice. When Evelyn stepped into the small glass meeting room and saw him sitting there, her face remained unreadable. She didn't flinch, didn't tilt her head. She simply walked to the other side of the table, placed her notebook down, and offered a formal nod. "Good afternoon," she said. Owen blinked twice, unsure if she truly recognized him or was playing a cruel trick, but Evelyn knew. She had known from the moment she saw the slant of his shoulders through the glass, a posture she had memorized in another life. She took her seat and opened the notebook, her pen poised with the calm confidence of someone who no longer gave away her power for free. Owen cleared his throat and began his pitch. He spoke too fast, too broadly, layering jargon over vague promises. He mentioned partnerships he didn't have, markets he didn't understand, opportunities that didn't exist. Evelyn listened without interruption, her eyes fixed not on his face, but on the places where he faltered. Every pause, every fumble, every bloated number. When he was done, the silence stretched between them like a drawn-out breath. She closed her notebook, her hand resting gently on top of it. "Thank you for your time," she said. "We'll be in touch." He blinked, confused, his lips parting as if to object, but something in her tone, quiet but immovable, warned him against pushing further. She stood, offered him her hand. He hesitated, then took it. It was the same hand he had once bruised. Now it gripped his fingers with steady professionalism, cold and brief. He left the room still unsure if she had truly remembered him, or if she had dismissed him like any other stranger trying to sell a weak idea. She didn't look back. Later that evening, Evelyn sat alone in her office, with the city lights flickering outside, the soft hum of engines rising and falling like lullabies from the runway below. She replayed the meeting in her mind, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The man she had once loved, feared, followed, he no longer existed. In his place was someone smaller, someone frayed. She felt no triumph, no revenge, only distance. There was nothing left of her inside his orbit. What she had built at Vere, the staff who respected her, the terminal cafe, the revived airstrip Nico once called a graveyard, it all stood not because of Owen, but in spite of him. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The past had tried to walk through her door, and she had greeted it not as a victim but as a witness. She opened her eyes again and reached for her phone. There were schedules to finalize, maintenance requests to approve, a staffing issue at the domestic terminal that needed her voice. Her work hadn't paused just because a ghost had come knocking. She wasn't that girl anymore. The one who stood frozen at a gate, cheeks flushed with shame and confusion. That girl still lived inside her somewhere, tucked away like an old coat, not forgotten, but no longer worn. She stood from her chair and walked to the window, watching one of their flights taxi into place. Its lights blinked in rhythm, steady and bright, disappearing into the darkness with the promise of return. Evelyn Wade watched it disappear, not with longing, but with ownership. The mornings began earlier now, though not because Evelyn set an alarm. Her body woke before the sun, stirred by an internal clock no longer tied to survival but to motion, the gentle hum of preparation, the quiet thrill of stewardship. She no longer flinched at sudden sounds or carried her weight like a burden waiting to be dropped. Her presence moved through Avere's corridors like something built into the walls, calm, invisible, but structurally essential. The once simple cafe had expanded to 3 locations within the airport, each one designed not for flash, but for comfort. Flyers remembered her face, even if they didn't know her name. Some thought she was a hospitality manager, others a corporate representative, but none guessed she was the force beneath every polished tile and late-night operational memo. Her name didn't need to be spoken. It was stitched into policy, routine, atmosphere. On her desk now sat 3 phones, each serving a different branch of Avere's growing network, domestic, regional, and long haul. The airstrip Nico once stood on, rusted and forgotten, now welcomed mid-sized jets. What had once been considered a ruin was now a checkpoint. Workers clocked in and out without ever knowing whose hands had drawn the plans that made their jobs possible. Evelyn never boasted. Success, to her, was never about noise. It was about permanence. And permanence, she had learned, was built not from applause, but from endurance, long nights, thoughtful decisions, and the refusal to let chaos write the final chapter. On the surface, she had all the makings of someone who had arrived, a structured calendar, a silent car that responded to the pressure of a single button, staff who stood when she entered a room. But Evelyn never treated her success like a prize. It was a tool, sharp, useful, and designed to be handled with care. Sometimes she sat by the runway fence after hours, watching aircraft blink their way into the clouds. They never looked hurried. That fascinated her. The machines bore thousands of pounds of weight and pressure, yet they rose gently, gliding upward, as if they were built from air itself. It reminded her of a truth she'd come to believe. Grace wasn't the absence of gravity. It was the ability to rise through it anyway. No one saw the moment she visited the old coffee stand and quietly handed its management to a young girl named Camila, 19, nervous, full of potential. Camila had once spilled an entire tray of cappuccinos and cried in the storage closet for 20 minutes. Evelyn found her that day and said nothing, only helped mop up the mess, handed her a dry apron, and nodded. Now, 2 years later, Evelyn passed the keys to her with the same silent authority Nico once offered her. And Camila, not knowing the full story, accepted them with both hands and a quiet promise not to disappoint. Evelyn didn't need gratitude. She didn't need a plaque. Her satisfaction came in the ripple, the knowing that someone else would now taste freedom one decision at a time. One afternoon, months after Owen had sat across from her in that glass conference room, a letter arrived in the main Avere mailbox. No return address. No name. The handwriting was vaguely familiar, not in its shape, but in its hesitation. Inside was a single page. A brief note. A line about how people burn bridges and then stand there stunned when no one builds them back. A vague reference to Carriage Falls, followed by an apology. The word was not underlined, not embellished, just present, like an object placed on a table. Evelyn read it once, then again. She didn't tear it, didn't file it. She simply folded it neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, beneath the ledger from the company's first quarter and Nico's original airfield lease agreement. She didn't share it with anyone. It was never about holding on to bitterness. She had outgrown that. But some things weren't meant to be discarded. They were meant to be kept, not as keepsakes, but as evidence. Not of pain, but of distance. A line drawn in the sand, a bookmark in a chapter no longer open. She didn't write back. There was no need. Life had answered louder than any letter could. She had taken the slap he delivered all those years ago and turned it into a compass, one that never pointed back toward him, but forward, always forward, toward a life he would never step into. It wasn't until the third year of Avaire's expansion that Evelyn finally returned to Norfield International as a passenger, not an operator. Her staff booked the ticket, organized the itinerary, and left a handwritten note on her seat wishing her safe travels. She wore a dark trench coat and carried no luggage. It was a day trip, a single meeting across the border, a deal to be signed with an airport board eager to license Avaire's name. She didn't feel nervous walking through the familiar glass doors. She didn't feel haunted. Instead, she moved like someone returning not to a scene of a crime, but to a field where she had once buried something and allowed something else to grow. When she reached gate 47B, she paused. The bench she had once sat on was still there. The seats had been updated, the flooring changed, but the space held the same shape. She walked to the window and looked out at the tarmac. Another jet was boarding. Families, business travelers, couples. No one knew that this was where Evelyn Wade had once lost everything. And that was the beauty of it, the anonymity. No plaque would mark it. No story would be told here but hers, silently, internally. As the final boarding call echoed, she turned away from the glass, not with nostalgia, not even with satisfaction, but with peace. The kind that only comes when a person knows they have walked through fire and no longer smell of smoke. She boarded without hesitation. She did not look back. No matter who tries to break your spirit or hold you back, never forget your worth isn't defined by where they leave you, but by where you choose to rise. You are not what happened to you. You are what you become in the face of it. Don't rush your healing. Don't explain your silence. And when your time comes to soar, don't apologize for flying higher than those who tried to clip your wings. May you rise from every place you were once left behind. May every bruise become a badge of survival. May your heart remain soft, even when the world turns cold. May your voice return stronger, even if it trembled once in silence. May doors open that no hands can shut. May grace follow you into rooms where doubt once lived. And may you always walk like you belong because you do. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.